So Sherry asked this question. She said the biggest question that she's had in her spirit is this: Lord, is this really what you intended the church to look like and how you intended the church to function? If not, what needs to change? And how do I need to change to see your kingdom come? Now, that's a great question. Now, a couple different things I love about it. One, it's a question that she's had before the Lord, that she's asking the Lord and looking for the Lord for the answer. And two, the question is looking at herself, not what does everybody else need to change? How does other people need to change? But how do I need to change to see this happen? Which is always where it needs to come back to, because the only thing that we can control is ourselves. We can't control anybody else, anyone else, any other church, any other group, but we can control ourselves and who we are and how we respond to the Lord. So is this how the Lord expects or wants his church to look and to respond? Yes and no. One, God knows exactly where we're at, and he's not surprised by where the church is at, and he's not in a rush to get the church to change. He wants the church to change. He's inviting the church to change, yes. But it's not like he's like, I can't believe they haven't changed yet. I'm so tired of this. He doesn't have that attitude whatsoever. He's calling us into more. He's constantly calling us into more. But we get to respond to that calling into more. Now, what does he want the church to look like? The Bible clearly describes what he wants the church to look like. And probably the best passage is Ephesians chapter 4. Now, I would suggest reading from verse 1 all the way to verse 16. I'm just going to paraphrase the second part of that, where he talks about the church not being tossed to and fro by waves of doctrine, by every person doing their part, fulfilling their part, that the church reveals a mature expression of who Jesus is so that the world can see Jesus, and so that the church builds itself up in love. Now, this is what the church is supposed to look like. It's supposed to reveal Jesus to the world. It's supposed to have every part playing a part. And it's supposed to be building itself up in love, strengthening itself, strengthening the foundations, edifying itself up in love, so that every piece is working together, accomplishing what every piece is supposed to accomplish, so that Jesus is revealed and that we're not just being tossed about by every new thing that comes on the scene. So this is a couple of the concerns that we have when we look at the church today. Much of the church is running to and fro, chasing after every new wind and wave of doctrine. We're going after the new thing. We go to conferences because people promise that they're going to give us a new revelation. We buy a book because somebody promises a new revelation, and we won't buy a book if somebody says, well, you're probably not going to hear anything new in this, but I'm going to confirm some old things. Why would we be interested in that? I want the new thing, because we're constantly looking for the new. We're constantly looking for the latest and the greatest. And this addiction to the latest and the greatest has created so much problem in the church. So this brings it back to the personal application. What can I do? I need to value right doctrine and not get caught up with a fascination with the new thing. You know, when Paul goes to Athens and he's getting ready to teach at the Areopagus, he's talking about the pagan philosophers, Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, talking about the pagan philosophers, and says, you know, they love to hear the latest thing, the new thing. And so they were constantly talking about whatever the new thing was. These were the pagans. These were not the believers. You know, the believers constantly devoted themselves to the reading of the scripture, which was the Old Testament. That's the only scripture that they had back then. And the teaching of the apostles, which would be the New Testament for us. that they were constantly going back to that. But if we had somebody that's going to do a conference on the book of Isaiah, a lot of us that are pursuing the things of the Spirit wouldn't go to it because, I mean, it's the book of Isaiah. I could go read the book of Isaiah. Like, what's God saying today? Like, what's your latest dream? When's the last time you saw an angel? What did he say? What's going to be happening tomorrow? We want to hear the new thing, but we don't value the old thing. And because of that, we're not anchored in the reality of Christ. Paul talks about in Colossians, he talks about those that are puffed up in their sensuous minds, their minds that are just based on their senses. They keep on talking again and again about their visions and their angelic encounters, and they've moved on beyond Christ. They're no longer talking about Jesus and keeping that as the foundation. Now, they probably give a nod to Jesus because, Christians, if they don't get a nod to Jesus, they stop listening. But they don't really talk about Jesus. They talk about the new thing. They talk about their experience, their encounter. There's a time and a place to talk about those things, but you need to spend more time in the foundations than you do on the other things, and they never go beyond Christ. It's like we've heard enough about Jesus. Now we need to hear more about angels. I actually remember hearing a prophetic person saying that they'd had an encounter with an angel that told them that the church had heard enough about Jesus and they needed to be taught about how to engage with angels. That was not an angel. That was a demon. No angel from God would ever say that. That is clearly anti-Christ. And it's the path that we go down. Now, this is why we're tossed about by every wind and wave of doctrine. I think that the church of tomorrow, the church that God is looking for, it's all about Jesus. It looks like Jesus. It smells like Jesus. And it feels like Jesus because everybody individually is manifesting Jesus, serving one another in the power of the Spirit and serving those around them in the power of the Spirit. And it's obvious what Jesus looks like and who Jesus is from the lives of the believers and from the message that's being proclaimed. And the only way that that happens is when everybody does their piece. And when those that are in the place of leadership are anchoring the people in the reality of who Jesus is and keeping them from being tossed here and there by every new wind and wave of doctrine, not creating the new wind and wave of doctrine to sell more books or to get more people to come to the conferences. And I know this from my own temptation to move beyond when God has me anchored in something that's old. I had a year where I traveled and I was only allowed to talk about foundational doctrines. What is salvation? Who is Jesus? The cross, the blood, redemption. It had to be about, I couldn't talk about any of the new things. And people don't always want to hear that. Some do. Some love it. And I know many of you do. That's why you're listening, because this is a passion that we have. But this is the church that Jesus is looking for. So I need to fight in my own heart that temptation to be fascinated by the new thing and not be fascinated with the old thing, which is Jesus, who is the new thing. I remember one time that Jesus it made it very clear to me, not in exact words and audible words, but made it very clear with impressions in my heart that the only way to go higher in the Spirit is to go deeper into the foundations. The only way that we're going to go higher in the Spirit is to go deeper. If we want to understand, we want to move into the deeper things of God, the only way to move into the deeper things of God is to go back. Go back to the cross, go back to the blood, go back to redemption. What is salvation? What does that actually mean? Because as we lay those foundations, we create a heart of service in ourselves. We create a heart of stability that allows us to have something to move forward in. And I've found just in my travel, I love to have people ask me questions and develop it, because it usually takes things into places where the Spirit is prompting curiosity that maybe I hadn't caught yet in the Spirit. And so it allows things to go in really cool directions. So I love saying, well, is there any questions? And I've seen this pattern in places where people are doing ministry and they're actively doing stuff. They always have the best questions. And people that are just listening to the latest things and it's just about information and entertainment, they rarely have good questions. Their questions are usually, well, what's the last thing that God showed you? Well, what's happening next week? Or what's happening next year? But the people that are doing things, they're like, well, I've run into this problem. I was praying for this person and they didn't get healed, and I couldn't discern a demon there. I didn't know what it was. Why didn't they get healed? Now all of a sudden we've got somewhere we can go. We've got somewhere of depth that we can go to. Somebody that's been experiencing things. So when you begin to put into practice what you've learned, you always end up with better questions. I know that's a side note, but it's not a side note. It's one of the ways that we can discern where we're at. Have we learned more than we put into practice? What are we doing with what we have? See, we've been called into the way. Christianity was called the way. It's never been called the think. We've turned it into the think, but it's the way. What's the way? How are we living? How are we looking like Jesus? I've been watching, I don't know how many of you have seen this new series called The Chosen. You download the app and you can watch it. It's on the life of Jesus. They just finished up, as of right now, they finished up season 1. I think they're doing and working on season 2 right now, but they're planning on doing a number of seasons. We'll see how that happens. But that series has given me such a beautiful picture of Jesus. I just cry. And my heart is saying, I want to be more like that. I want to be more like that. I want to be like Jesus. See, if we want the church to come into what the church is supposed to come into, I've got to take responsibility for me becoming like Jesus. How am I caring for those that other people don't care for? How am I stepping out of judgment and walking in compassion and mercy? How am I loving the poor? How am I reaching out, expecting God to do something that's beyond what I can do? How do I manifest Jesus in this situation? If I start living like that and you start living like that and the person next to us starts living like that, we will have a church that is a mature expression of Jesus, and the world will take note and Father's heart will be satisfied. That's what the church is supposed to look like.